the ballroom fell silent. Every conversation, every laugh, every whispered secret, gone in an instant. 300 candles burned above a crowd of earls, countesses, and carefully maintained reputations, and not one of them made a sound. The Duchess of Ashford had risen from her chair. She had lifted one gloved hand, and now she was presenting her son's future bride to the most powerful room in the county. The applause was immediate. It was polished. It was completely hollow. And the young woman standing in the light, heart hammering beneath layers of borrowed silk, knew something that no one else in that ballroom did. She was not supposed to be there at all. She was the maid. But before I tell you what happened next, if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now. Here we tell stories that stay with you long after they're over. Now, let's go back to where everything began. The grand ballroom of Ashford Hall had seen many evenings worth remembering, but none quite like this one. The chandeliers burned with 300 candles, their light spilling across silk gowns and polished metals, across faces that had spent decades learning how to smile without meaning it. The music had been playing for exactly 40 minutes when the Duchess of Ashford rose from her chair, lifted one gloved hand, and the orchestra stopped. Every conversation in that room died within seconds. Earls leaned toward countesses. Young ladies straightened their spines. Even the footmen near the walls seemed to hold their breath, trays balanced at perfect angles, eyes forward. The Duchess was not a woman who asked for silence. She simply arrived, and silence followed. "My son," she said, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "has found his future." She turned slightly, just enough to gesture toward the figure standing at the edge of the room. A young woman in pale blue, her gloved hands folded, her eyes fixed on the middle distance with an expression no one in that ballroom could quite read. The applause that followed was immediate, polished, and completely hollow, and the young woman standing in the light, heart hammering beneath layers of borrowed silk, knew something that no one else in that room did. She was not supposed to be there at all. Her name was Wren, not a name that appeared in any guest list, any family ledger, any registry of notable households in the county. It was the kind of name given quickly, without ceremony, the way you name something you don't expect to keep. She had arrived at Ashford Hall 3 years prior with a single trunk, a letter of recommendation from a vicar who had since passed, and the particular talent of moving through a room without disturbing it. She had learned early that invisibility was its own kind of skill, the way to carry a tray without the silverware whispering, the way to enter a room mid-conversation and leave without the conversation pausing. She knew which floorboards groaned on the east corridor, which candles burned fastest near the drafty windows, which of the upstairs maids cried quietly on Sunday evenings, and needed nothing more than a cup of tea left outside the door without comment. Ashford Hall was a world she understood completely, precisely because she had never been meant to be part of it. And yet, 3 nights ago, the Duchess had summoned her. Not to the servants' hall, not to the small receiving room where household matters were discussed. To her private sitting room, where the fire burned low and the curtains were already drawn. Wren had stood in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her apron, and the Duchess had looked at her for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "Sit down, child. What I am about to ask you will sound impossible. I need you to listen before you refuse." The sitting room smelled of dried lavender and old paper, the particular scent of a woman who had outlived most of what she loved. The Duchess did not pour tea. She did not offer pleasantries. She simply looked at Wren with those pale gray eyes that had always reminded the staff of winter glass, and she began to speak. Lady Cecilia Hargrove, the young woman formerly betrothed to the Duke of Ashford, had disappeared 4 days prior, not vanished in any dramatic sense. She had simply written a letter to her mother, boarded a private coach, and by morning was somewhere on the continent with a French painter of no particular fortune and even less reputation. The engagement, the Duchess explained, had been announced publicly. The guests for the formal introduction ball had already been invited, and her son, her proud, guarded, dangerously perceptive son, was already suspicious that something had gone wrong. "I cannot allow a scandal," the Duchess said. The firelight caught the lines around her mouth, the careful set of her jaw. "Not now, not with what is at stake." She paused, and in that pause was the full weight of everything she wasn't saying. "You will stand in her place, only for the evening, only long enough for the announcement to hold. After that, I will manage the rest." She slid a small velvet box across the table. Inside was a bracelet, delicate, gold, unmistakably expensive. "You are the right height, the right bearing, and unlike most people in this house," her voice dropped almost imperceptibly, "you know how to keep a secret." Wren stared at the bracelet for a long time. Then she looked up, and she made the worst decision of her life. She said yes. She said it quietly, without drama, the way she did most things. And the moment the word left her mouth, she felt the room shift in a way she couldn't name. The Duchess closed the velvet box and stood immediately, as though the matter were already resolved, and the rest was simply logistics. There was no warmth in her expression. There was, however, something that might have been relief, and relief, Wren had learned, was more dangerous than gratitude. Gratitude could be forgotten. Relief created debt. The preparation had taken 2 full days. A lady's maid Wren had never seen before arrived with 3 trunks, and a silence so total it felt deliberate. There were lessons, not in etiquette exactly, but in absence. How to stand without occupying too much space. How to smile without inviting further inquiry. How to hold a glass of champagne without ever actually drinking from it. The woman conducting these instructions never gave her name. She corrected Wren's posture 6 times in the first hour and said nothing encouraging the entire second day. By the final evening, Wren could move through a room in silk and look precisely like someone who had been born doing exactly that. But what she feared was not the ballroom. It was not the earls or the countesses or the polished smiles. What she feared, the thing that kept her awake the night before, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling of the guest room they had placed her in, was him. She had seen the Duke of Ashford exactly 11 times in 3 years, always at a distance, always moving with that particular stillness that distinguished men who had learned very young that they did not need to announce themselves. He had never once looked in her direction. She told herself that was a good thing. She was almost certain she was wrong. Lord Edmund Ashford had inherited 2 things from his father: the dukedom and the habit of watching. Not obviously. Nothing about Edmund was obvious. He watched the way a man watches a fire, without appearing to watch at all, taking in information in layers while his expression remained exactly as composed as the occasion required. His mother called it perception. His former schoolmates had called it unsettling. His late father had called it the only inheritance worth passing down. He had known something was wrong before his mother finished her sentence. It was nothing specific at first, a quality of stillness in the room that didn't match the occasion, a slight tension in his mother's shoulders that she was too skilled to show anywhere else. And then there was the woman in pale blue. She stood exactly as a lady should stand. She smiled at precisely the correct moments. Her gloves were immaculate, her posture was faultless, and she had not once, in 40 minutes, made eye contact with a single person in that room for longer than 3 seconds. That last detail was the one that caught him. Ladies trained in avoidance were usually avoiding something specific. He simply hadn't yet determined what. He crossed the room twice without approaching her. The third time, he stopped at a distance of perhaps 4 feet and studied her profile while pretending to listen. To a colonel recount a hunting story he had already heard twice. Her jaw was set with a tension that silk and candlelight almost concealed. Her breathing was controlled, deliberately so the way a person breathes when they are reminding themselves to breathe. And her hands, he noticed, folded elegantly at her waist, perfectly composed, had a small callus at the base of the right index finger, the kind left by years of carrying heavy trays. Edmund said nothing. He turned back to the colonel, and for the first time in a very long while, he found himself genuinely curious about another person. You've just met everyone in that ballroom. You've seen the Duchess make her move. You've watched Edmund notice the one detail that no one else did. But here's what no one in that room understood yet. The secret that brought that young woman to the ballroom in borrowed silk goes far deeper than one missing fiancé. What the Duchess was really protecting, and what was truly at stake, I'm going to tell you. Keep watching. The morning after the ball arrived with the particular cruelty of English autumn, gray light pressing through heavy curtains, cold air finding every gap in the window frames, the house exhaling the stale warmth of the night before. Wren sat at the vanity in the guest room and looked at her reflection with the detached attention of someone taking inventory. The borrowed earrings, the carefully dressed hair, the pale blue gown now hanging on the wardrobe door, like evidence of something she hadn't yet decided how to feel about. She had survived the evening. That was the word she kept returning to. Survived. Not performed, not succeeded, not deceived. Survived. She had stood in that ballroom for 2 hours and 40 minutes, accepted congratulations from people whose names she would never remember, and smiled at precisely the angles she had been taught. No one had questioned her. No one had pulled aside a curtain or demanded an explanation. The Duchess had moved through the room like a general surveying a won battle, and by the time the last guests had filtered out into the cold night air, the engagement of the Duke of Ashford had been publicly confirmed, and the matter, as far as Ashford Hall's social obligations were concerned, was settled. What was not settled was the morning, because the Duchess had said one evening, and the sun had now risen on a second day, and no one had come to tell Wren she could go back downstairs. No one had returned her uniform. No one had said anything at all. She pulled off one glove slowly and looked at her hand. The slight roughness at the base of her fingers, the small scar along her left palm from a broken glass 2 winters ago. These were her hands. They did not belong in this room. And yet, here she was, still in it, with no instructions, and a growing certainty that one evening had never been the Duchess's actual plan. Lady Isabel Fenton arrived at Ashford Hall on the 3rd day. She had not been invited. She had, however, heard the announcement, as had everyone within a reasonable distance of 3 counties. And she had decided, with the particular confidence of a woman who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion she valued, that she deserved an explanation. She was the eldest daughter of the Earl of Fenwick. She had been privately considered the most likely match for the Duke since the previous spring, and she was not accustomed to being surprised by other people's engagements. She found Wren in the east drawing room, where the Duchess had installed her for the morning under the pretense of correspondence practice. Lady Isabel did not knock. She stepped inside, assessed Wren from the doorway with the slow precision of someone appraising livestock, and smiled the kind of smile that carries no warmth whatsoever, only information. "So," she said, setting her gloves down on the side table as though she owned it. "You are the mystery." She moved closer, studying Wren's face with open curiosity and less open hostility. "You have good bones. I'll grant her that much." The Duchess always had an eye. What followed was not a conversation. It was an excavation, conducted with perfect manners and absolute ruthlessness. Lady Isabel asked about Wren's family, her education, her previous season, her connections. Each answer Wren gave, carefully constructed, precisely vague, was received with a small smile that suggested the inadequacy of the response without ever stating it directly. By the time Lady Isabel retrieved her gloves and made her exit, she had said nothing directly unkind. She had also made absolutely certain that Wren understood in full the distance between where she was sitting and where she actually belonged. The fire in the drawing room crackled steadily. Wren sat very still and said nothing. It was a skill she had been practicing far longer than one season. It was the small things that gave her away, not to the guests, not to the household staff who had been quietly instructed to treat her as a guest and ask no questions, but to herself. She still reached for the door handle before the footman could open it, then stopped herself mid-gesture. She still woke before 5, her body refusing the luxury of sleeping past the hour when the morning fires needed lighting. She still folded her own linens out of instinct, smoothing the corners with the automatic precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before the conscious mind was fully awake. On the 4th morning, she found one of the younger housemaids struggling with a stuck window latch in the corridor. The same latch that had been stiff since the previous winter, the same one that required lifting the frame slightly while turning the handle, a trick Wren had discovered herself months ago. She fixed it without thinking, her hands moving with the quiet competence of someone who knew this house in a way that no visiting fiancé ever could. The housemaid stared at her. Wren straightened, smoothed her skirt, and walked on without explanation. Behind her, she heard the girl say nothing, but she felt the weight of the silence. That evening, after the household had settled and the corridors had gone quiet, she slipped down to the kitchen, not for any reason she could have justified to the Duchess, simply because the kitchen was the only room in Ashford Hall where she still felt like herself. She sat at the far end of the long wooden table and accepted a cup of tea from the cook, who asked no questions and expected no conversation. The fire in the great hearth burned orange and low. The smell of the day's bread still hung in the warm air. For 20 minutes, she was no one's fiancé, no one's deception, no one's carefully maintained secret. She was just Wren, sitting in the warmth, holding a cup with both hands the way she always had. It was the most honest she had felt in days. There were things about Edmund Ashford that the county understood, and things it had simply decided. It understood that he was the last of his line, that he had inherited at 22 under circumstances no one discussed in polite company, and that he administered his estates with a precision that bordered on severity. What it had decided, collectively, over years of observation and speculation, was that he was cold, remote, that the reserve he carried was either arrogance or damage, and that the distinction didn't much matter, since the result was the same. What the county did not know was the study, a room on the second floor, east-facing, that smelled of old maps and wood polish, where Edmund spent the hours between midnight and 2 in the morning, reading correspondence from his tenant farmers, reviewing drainage plans for the lower fields, and occasionally, when the work was done and the house was silent, sitting in the armchair by the window and looking at nothing in particular for long stretches of time. He had inherited a dukedom, yes. He had also inherited 340 families who depended on the land to eat, and he had never once allowed himself to forget that the title was the least important thing about the responsibility. His mother had arranged engagements before, twice, in fact. Both dissolved quietly before reaching announcement, both times because Edmund had looked at the young woman in question and seen, very clearly, someone performing the idea of a future rather than actually wanting one. He had said as much to his mother, both times, in the flat, precise tone that she knew better than to argue with. This time she had not consulted him at all. She had simply presented him with a fait accompli in a ballroom full of witnesses. That, more than anything else, told him the situation was more complicated than she was willing to say. He was going to find out why. He always did. It was the library that brought them into the same room without the Duchess present for the first time. Wren had taken to spending the early evenings there, not because it was expected of her, but because it was the one room in the house where silence had a legitimate excuse. She had pulled a volume of natural history from the lower shelf, the kind of book no one at a dinner party would ever discuss, and had been reading it for 40 minutes when the door opened and Edmund walked in. He saw her immediately. He always saw her immediately. She had begun to understand that about him, the way his attention organized a room the moment he entered it, filing everything into its correct position. He did not appear surprised. He crossed to his own desk, retrieved a document he had apparently come for, and was almost at the door again when he paused. "You moved the volume on migratory birds," he said, without turning around. "It was on the third shelf. You've placed it on the second." Wren looked up from her book. "The third shelf catches the draft from the east window," she said, before she could stop herself. The binding was warping. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, exactly, but very awake. He turned then, looked at her with that level, unhurried attention she had seen him direct at things he was genuinely trying to understand. "You know this house," he said. It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was simply an observation, offered in the same tone he might use to note a change in weather. Wren held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds longer than she should have. "Your mother gave me a thorough introduction," she said carefully. Edmund nodded once, slowly. "Of course she did," he said. And the way he said it, quiet, precise, carrying the full weight of everything he had not yet decided to say out loud, told her that the distance between what he suspected and what he knew was smaller than she had hoped. If this story is keeping you on the edge of your seat, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what comes next. Hit that button now, because what's about to happen in the next part of this story is the moment everything changes. She arrived on a Tuesday, without warning, in a coach bearing the Hargrove family crest. Lady Cecilia had apparently reconsidered, or more precisely, the French painter had apparently reconsidered, somewhere between Lyon and the Swiss border. And Lady Cecilia had found herself in a foreign country with insufficient funds and a reputation she was not yet willing to sacrifice. She had written to her mother, her mother had written to the Duchess. And now she was here, stepping out of a travel-worn carriage in the front courtyard with the particular expression of someone who has made a significant error and is not yet ready to fully admit it. Wren was standing at the upper corridor window when the coach arrived. She watched Lady Cecilia descend, tall, genuinely beautiful, wearing a traveling coat of deep green that, even after several days of continental roads, still managed to look intentional. She watched the Duchess meet her at the door, and from this distance she could not hear the words, but she could read the Duchess's posture exactly. Controlled, urgent, and not pleased. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Then both women went inside, and the house absorbed them the way it absorbed everything, quietly, completely, without changing its expression. For a long moment, Wren stood very still at the window. The courtyard below was empty now, the coach being led to the stables, the footmen dispersing. The pale autumn light fell across the stone without warmth. She had known this moment was coming, had known it, in fact, since the first night, had filed it under inevitable, and tried not to look at it too directly. And yet, standing here now, watching the space where Lady Cecilia had been, she felt something she hadn't expected. Not relief, not fear. Something quieter and more inconvenient than either. She pressed one hand briefly against the cold glass of the window. Then she turned, straightened her spine, and went to find out what the Duchess intended to do next. She did not have to go far. Lady Cecilia was standing at the end of the corridor, still in her traveling coat, still carrying the particular composure of someone who has rehearsed this moment. She looked at Wren for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, very quietly, "So, it was you." It was not a question. It carried no venom, only the flat recognition of someone who has just understood the shape of something they had suspected. Wren did not look away. "Only for the evening," she said. "That was what I was told." Lady Cecilia studied her face with an attention that felt, strangely, more honest than anything else that had happened in that house. Then she gave a single, small nod. Not forgiveness, exactly, not absolution, but something that acknowledged the truth of what had been said. She walked past Wren without another word. The scent of her traveling coat, cold air, and something faintly floral lingered briefly in the corridor. Then it was gone. Lady Cecilia has arrived. The Duchess is cornered, and Wren is standing at a window watching the woman she was pretending to be walk through the front door. But here's what none of them know yet. There is a letter hidden in this house that will make the question of who is the real fiancé completely irrelevant. Because what that letter contains doesn't just threaten the engagement. It threatens everything Edmund Ashford believes about who he is. That letter is coming. Stay with me. The Duchess received Wren in the same sitting room where everything had begun. The lavender and old paper smell was the same. The fire burned at the same low angle. But the Duchess herself was different. Not visibly, not in any way that a casual observer would have catalogued. But Wren had spent 3 years learning to read this house and everyone in it, and she could see it clearly. The careful composure was still there. Underneath it, for the first time, was something that looked very much like fear. She did not explain Lady Cecilia's arrival. She did not apologize for the extension of an arrangement that had been promised as temporary. What she did instead was pour 2 cups of tea, an act so unprecedented in their history that Wren felt the gesture more acutely than any words, and set one on the table in front of her. The situation has become more complicated, the Duchess said, in the tone of someone describing a weather pattern rather than the unraveling of an elaborate deception. I need more time. Wren looked at the teacup. She did not reach for it. More time for what, Your Grace? She asked quietly. The Duchess was silent for a long moment. The fire shifted, sending a brief wash of orange light across her face, and in that moment, she looked older than Wren had ever seen her. Not frail, never frail, but tired in the particular way of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time, without being able to set it down. There are things about my son's situation that I have not been able to tell him, she said finally. Things that affect the title, the inheritance, everything. She looked at Wren with those winter glass eyes. I needed him settled before the truth came out. I needed him to have something worth holding on to. She paused. I did not anticipate that the something would turn out to be... She stopped, picked up her own cup, did not finish the sentence. And the unfinished sentence sat between them like a lit candle in a room full of paper. It was the housekeeper, Mrs. Calloway, who found it, or rather, who found it and understood immediately that she should not have, and brought it directly to Wren rather than to anyone else in the house. This small decision, made in a corridor outside the linen room on a gray Wednesday morning, was the kind of thing that changed everything without announcing itself. The letter was old. The paper had the particular brittleness of something that had been folded and unfolded many times, and the ink had faded at the edges to a warm brown. It was addressed in a hand Wren did not recognize to the late Duke of Ashford, Edmund's father, and the date at the top was 23 years prior. Said Zia. Calloway had found it inside the lining of a trunk being prepared for storage, the kind of trunk that hadn't been opened since the old Duke's death, and probably should have remained that way. She had read enough of it to know it should not exist. Then she had folded it, walked the length of 3 corridors, and placed it in Wren's hands with the expression of someone transferring a problem they are not equipped to solve. Wren read it twice. Then she sat down on the narrow bench outside the linen room and read it a third time, slowly, making sure she had understood each sentence correctly. The letter was from a solicitor. It detailed, in the careful formal language of legal correspondence, an arrangement made between the late Duke and a family whose name Wren recognized, a minor, noble family from the northern counties, unremarkable in every way except one. The arrangement concerned a child, a settlement, and a condition attached to the title of Ashford that, if made public, would rewrite everything Edmund believed about who he was and what he had inherited. Wren folded the letter, held it in both hands, and sat very quietly for a long time, listening to the house breathe around her. She was still sitting there when she heard the footsteps, not the brisk, purposeful steps of a housekeeper, not the careful quiet of a maid. These were slower, deliberate. The Duchess appeared at the end of the corridor and stopped when she saw Wren, saw, more precisely, what Wren was holding. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The gray morning light fell between them without warmth. Then the Duchess said, in a voice pitched so low it barely carried, "Where did you find it?" Not a question, an inventory. Wren looked at her steadily. "Inside the trunk lining. Mrs. Calloway brought it to me." Another silence. The Duchess looked at the folded letter, then at Wren's face, with the expression of someone revising a calculation they thought they had already completed. "And have you decided," she said carefully, "what you intend to do with it?" Wren held her gaze. "Not yet," she said. It was the most honest answer she had. The Duchess studied her for a long moment. that winter glass attention, reading everything and revealing nothing. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. She did not ask for the letter. She did not threaten. She simply left, which told Wren more than any demand would have. It rained that night with the kind of commitment that makes candlelight feel like the only honest thing left in the world. Wren had not been able to sleep. She had been sitting in the window seat of the guest room for 2 hours, the letter locked in the small writing desk across the room, her thoughts moving in careful circles that kept arriving at the same impossible center. At 11:30, she gave up on sleep entirely, took a candle, and went to the library. Edmund was already there. He was sitting in the armchair by the cold fireplace, not reading, not working, simply sitting in the dark the way she had seen him sit once before, looking at nothing with the focused attention of a man conducting an internal argument he hadn't yet resolved. He looked up when she entered. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The rain hit the tall windows in irregular waves. The candle she carried made the room feel smaller than it was, and the shadows it threw were warm and unsteady. She almost left. She nearly turned around, offered some murmured apology, retreated back down the corridor. Instead, she crossed to the other chair, the one on the opposite side of the cold fireplace, and sat down. She set the candle on the small table between them, and for the first time since the night of the ball, she looked at him without calculating anything. He saw it. She knew he saw it. The way her face had changed, the absence of the careful performance she had been maintaining for days. He didn't say anything immediately. He simply looked at her with that unhurried attention, and this time she didn't look away after 3 seconds. She let him look. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, drumming against the stone with sudden urgency, then settling back into its steady rhythm. "You're exhausted," he said finally. Not unkindly, simply as a fact. "Yes," she said. It was the most honest word she had spoken in 2 weeks. He nodded slowly, as though she had confirmed something he already knew. Then he reached forward and turned the candle slightly, so the light fell between them rather than directly on either of their faces. It was a small gesture. It was also, she understood, an act of extraordinary kindness, giving her somewhere to be that wasn't fully seen. She felt something shift in her chest that she did not have a name for yet. She did not tell him about the letter that night. She told herself it was because the moment wasn't right, because she needed to understand its full implications before she could explain them to anyone else, because the information required careful handling. All of these things were true. None of them were the real reason. The real reason, the one she admitted to herself the following morning, standing at the vanity with her hair half-dressed and her eyes honest in the glass, was that she was afraid. Not of his anger, not of the consequences for herself, though those were real enough. She was afraid of what would happen to him. She had watched Edmund Ashford for 3 years from a careful distance, and then up close for 2 weeks, and she had arrived at a conclusion she hadn't been looking for. He was a man who had organized his entire sense of himself around duty. Around the weight of the title, the responsibility of the land, the obligation to the name. The letter in that writing desk had the power to dismantle every foundation he had built his life upon, and she was the one holding it. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long time. The borrowed earrings, the carefully maintained fiction. The woman looking back at her was dressed like someone who belonged in this house, and carried the eyes of someone who knew exactly how little she did. "You are a maid," she told her reflection, without cruelty, simply as orientation. You found a letter that could destroy a man who has done nothing wrong, and you are running out of time to decide what to do with it." The reflection offered no argument. Outside her window, the last of the autumn leaves were giving up their grip on the elms, falling without drama into the wet gray morning. She reached up and removed one borrowed earring, then the other. Set them on the vanity with a small, definitive sound. Then she picked up the key to the writing desk. She had intended to go to the Duchess first. She had planned it carefully. The words she would use, the way she would present the letter, the quiet insistence that Edmund deserved to know. She had rehearsed it twice in the corridor outside the sitting room, her hand raised to knock, the letter folded inside her sleeve. Both times she had lowered her hand, because both times she had remembered the way the Duchess had looked in the firelight 2 evenings prior, not calculating, not cold, but tired in that profound way, and had said, "I needed him to have something worth holding on to." And Wren had understood, with a clarity that arrived like cold water, that the Duchess already knew she knew. Edmund found her in the garden. Not by design, she had gone outside for air, and he had come around the corner of the east hedge with his coat collar turned up against the cold, clearly returning from the stables. They stopped 3 feet apart on the gravel path, and something in her face must have told him immediately that this was not an accidental meeting in any meaningful sense, because he went very still and looked at her with the focused attention she had come to recognize as his version of alarm. She gave him the letter without a speech, simply took it from her sleeve and held it out, and when he took it, she stepped back and let him read. She watched his face while he did. She had expected anger, controlled, precise, delivered in that level tone. She had expected the jaw to set, the eyes to cool. What she had not expected was the stillness. He read the letter twice, the same way she had, and then he stood on the gravel path in the cold morning air and was quiet for so long that a blackbird landed 6 feet away and began investigating the frost-stiffened grass with complete indifference to either of them. When he finally looked up, his expression was not angry. It was something older and more complicated than anger. It was the face of a man who has just understood that a door he thought was solid has been open for years, and that everything on the other side is real. Edmund is now holding the truth in his hands. The disguise is broken. The letter has been read. The Duchess has confessed. Everything that was hidden is now in the open air, and it is colder and more real than any of them expected. But here is what I need you to understand before we reach the final part of this story. The hardest moment is still ahead, because knowing the truth is one thing, deciding what to do with it. When everything you were taught to value is pulling you in one direction, and everything you actually feel is pulling you in another. That is something else entirely. Don't go anywhere. He asked her one question. Not about the letter. Not yet. He asked, "Who are you?" And the way he said it was not the way Lady Isabel had excavated the question, not the social arithmetic of family and connections and seasons. It was simpler than that, and more serious. He was asking the thing beneath the thing. Wren looked at him on that frost-edged path, with the gray sky pressing down on the bare elms, and the blackbird still conducting its indifferent investigation nearby, and she made the only decision that felt like it belonged to her. "My name is Wren," she said. "I have worked in this house for 3 years. I carry trays. I know which floorboards creak and which candles burn fastest, and how to fix the latch on the east corridor window." She paused, Your mother asked me to stand in Lady Cecilia's place for one evening. I said yes because she asked me to, and because I didn't understand, at the time, how much one evening could become. She said it all in the same quiet tone she used for everything. Not confessional, not defensive. Simply true. The words fell into the cold air between them and stayed there. Edmund did not move for a long moment. The letter was still in his hand, held loosely now, as though he had forgotten about it. He looked at her, not with the assessing attention she was used to, but with something rawer than that, something that hadn't yet been organized into composure. Then he looked down at the gravel path, and she could see him doing what he always did, taking the information apart, filing it, finding its shape. When he looked up again, his expression had settled into something she couldn't fully read. 3 years, he said quietly. She nodded. He looked at the house, at the stone facade, the tall windows, the ivy gripping the east wall with determined fingers. And in 3 years, he said, I never once. He stopped. The unfinished sentence was its own kind of answer. No, Wren said gently. You didn't. It was not an accusation. It was simply the truth, offered without sharpness, the way she offered most things. The confrontation with the Duchess happened that same afternoon. Edmund requested her presence in the study, not the sitting room, not the drawing room, but the study, which, in the language of Ashford Hall, meant that what followed would be handled as a matter of fact rather than a matter of feeling. Wren sat in the chair near the window. The Duchess sat across from her son's desk. Edmund stood. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. Wren understood now that this was not restraint so much as precision, that he considered volume an imprecise instrument and preferred to let the exact weight of his words do the work. He placed the letter on the desk between them and asked his mother to explain, from the beginning, everything she had chosen not to tell him. The Duchess looked at the letter for a moment. Then she looked at Wren. Then she looked at her son. And something in her, some last calculation about what could still be managed, what could still be contained, appeared to simply stop. She told him everything. The letter was from a solicitor representing a claim against the Ashford title, a legitimate claim, rooted in a private arrangement his father had made before Edmund was born, one that created a conditional entailment on the estate that had never been disclosed. If the claim were pursued, the current title could be challenged. The Duchess had known for 2 years. She had been managing it quietly, negotiating, buying time. The engagement, the announcement, the ball, the borrowed fiancé, had been her attempt to establish Edmund's position publicly and firmly before the challenge could be made formal. She had not told him because she had believed, with the particular conviction of a woman accustomed to solving things alone, that she could resolve it before he ever needed to know. She had been wrong. The fire in the study burned steadily through all of it, indifferent to the weight of what was being said. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Edmund looked at his mother for a long moment, not with anger, not with the cold precision Wren had expected, but with something that looked almost like grief. "You should have told me," he said, "only that." The Duchess said nothing. Outside the window, the last light was leaving the sky, and the elms stood black and still against it. The solicitor arrived 2 days later. His name was Mr. Aldous Pemberton, and he carried himself with the careful neutrality of a man who had spent a career delivering information that other people found devastating. He was shown to the study, offered tea he did not drink, and presented his case with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared for resistance. and was mildly surprised not to encounter it immediately. The claim was legitimate. Edmund had spent the intervening 2 days with the letter and every related document his mother had finally surrendered from the locked drawer of her writing desk. Reading them in the early hours, in the lamp-lit quiet he used for everything that required his full attention. By the time Pemberton arrived, Edmund understood the situation completely. The conditional entailment his father had created was real. The family bringing the claim had standing. And there was, Pemberton explained carefully, one path by which the condition could be rendered void. A specific clause his father had included, perhaps optimistically, perhaps with exactly this contingency in mind. The clause required the Duke to be married, not engaged. Married, with the union registered and witnessed, before the claim was formally submitted to the courts. Pemberton had been instructed to allow 30 days. Edmund thanked him, showed him out personally, and returned to the study. He stood at the window for a long time, looking at the grounds, the frozen grass, the bare elms, the long gravel drive that ran all the way to the iron gate at the edge of the estate. 30 days. He turned the problem over with the same methodical attention he brought to drainage plans and tenant correspondence, and arrived at the same answer every time. There was one complication, however, one variable that did not behave like the others. He rang for the footman, asked him to find Wren, and let her know, at her convenience, that he would like a word. In the 2 days between Pemberton's visit and the moment Edmund rang for the footman, he had slept perhaps 6 hours total. He had read every document his mother surrendered, cross-referenced every date, followed every legal thread to its conclusion. He had done what he always did with difficult problems, taken them apart completely, examined each piece, and reassembled them until the shape was clear. The legal answer had presented itself within the first day. It was straightforward, if inconvenient, and he had no particular difficulty accepting it. What had taken the remainder of the time, the long hours in the lamp-lit study, the cold walks to the stables and back, the particular quality of stillness that his mother had learned over decades to leave undisturbed, was something that had nothing to do with the entailment. It was the other thing. The thing that had been true, he understood now, for longer than 2 weeks. Possibly for considerably longer than that. He had spent a great deal of time being a man who noticed everything and acted on very little. He had decided, sometime before dawn on the second day, that this was one instance where that particular habit had already cost him enough. He rang for the footman, asked him to find Wren, and let her know, at her convenience, that he would like a word. She came to the study expecting instructions, perhaps that she would be thanked, quietly and correctly, and returned to her place in the household with some arrangement made for discretion. Perhaps that she would be asked to leave altogether, a small pension, a letter of reference, a clean severance from everything that had happened. She had prepared herself for both possibilities during the walk down the corridor, and she arrived at the study door with her hands folded and her face composed, and the particular steadiness of someone who has already said goodbye to something before being asked to. Edmund was standing by the fireplace. He did not have papers in his hand. He was simply standing, and when she entered, he looked at her in the direct, unhurried way that she had stopped trying to interpret and had simply learned to meet. "I want to explain the situation to you," he said. He did, fully, without omission, the same way he had absorbed the information himself, clearly, factually, with respect for her capacity to understand it. He told her about the entailment, the claim, the clause, the 30 days. He told her what the clause required, and then he was quiet. Wren looked at him for a moment. "You are not asking me," she said carefully. "No," he said. "I am not asking you. I am telling you what is true, and then I am going to say something separate from it. And I need you to understand that the second thing is entirely independent of the first." He paused. The fire shifted between them. "I have spent 2 weeks watching you move through this house," he said, "and I have understood something that I should perhaps have understood 3 years ago, that the person I have been most consistently interested in talking to has been here the entire time, carrying trays and fixing window latches and leaving cups of tea outside doors for people who needed them." He looked at her with the full weight of that careful attention. "I am not asking you to solve a legal problem. I am asking you, separately, entirely, with no condition attached, whether you would consider staying. Not as anyone's solution, as your own choice." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, quiet and unhurried, covering the frozen grounds in white. Wren looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at her hands, the small callus, the pale scar, the hands that had always known exactly where they belonged. She looked up. "You never noticed me," she said quietly. "For 3 years." "No," he said. "I didn't." He held her gaze. "I intend to spend considerably longer making up for that." The wedding was small. Edmund had insisted on that, not out of indifference, but out of a precise understanding of what the occasion actually was, which was not a performance for the county, but a fact between two people, witnessed by enough souls to make it legal and no more. The church on the Ashford estate had stood for 400 years and smelled of cold stone and candle wax, and the particular stillness of a space that had absorbed centuries of significant moments and learned to hold them quietly. Lady Cecilia had returned to the continent, this time with her family's reluctant blessing, and a settlement arranged with characteristic efficiency by the Duchess, who had emerged from the confrontation in the study, not diminished, but, strangely, lighter. Lady Isabel Fenton, who had received a formal wedding announcement by post, and had chosen, with the particular dignity of someone who understands when a battle is already decided, not to respond to it, had quietly withdrawn from the county by the following week. No one remarked upon her absence. That, too, was a kind of answer. The Duchess, meanwhile, had spent the days since moving through the house with less of the braced quality Wren had always associated with her, as though the weight of the secret had been heavier than the secret itself, and setting it down had returned her something she hadn't realized she'd lost. On the morning of the wedding, she came to Wren's room herself, dismissed the lady's maid, and dressed her hair with her own hands. She said very little. At one point, studying Wren's reflection in the vanity mirror, she said quietly, "I chose you because you were steady, because this house needs steady." She paused, her hands still in Wren's hair. "I did not choose you for him." That part, a brief pause, almost imperceptible, I cannot take credit for. It was the closest she would ever come to an apology. Wren received it in the spirit it was offered. The claim against the title was formally withdrawn 6 weeks later. The family from the northern counties, having received, through Mr. Aldous Pemberton, both the marriage certificate and a quietly negotiated settlement that the Duchess had arranged with her characteristic efficiency, determined that the matter was concluded. Pemberton filed the withdrawal with the courts without ceremony, and noted in his private correspondence that, of all the cases he had managed in 30 years of practice, this was the first in which the resolution had appeared, from the outside, to be entirely genuine. Edmund read the withdrawal notice at his desk in the early morning. He sat with it for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, not because the legal matter required further consideration, but because the document in his hands was the last thread connecting him to a version of his father he had not yet fully made peace with. The man who had built that clause into the title had been trying, in his own imperfect way, to protect something. Edmund understood that now. He folded the notice, filed it in the correct drawer, and went to find his wife. He found her in the kitchen, of course he did, sitting at the long wooden table with both hands around a cup of tea, talking quietly with the cook about the state of the herb garden. She looked up when he came in. He crossed the room and sat down across from her without ceremony, and the cook, with the particular intelligence of someone who had watched this household for 20 years, found a reason to be elsewhere. They sat in the warm kitchen while the winter light came through the small windows, and the house moved into its morning around them. There was nothing dramatic left to resolve. The lies had been laid out and accounted for. The title was secure. The people who had needed to understand things now understood them. What remained was simply this: a man and a woman at a kitchen table in a house they both knew completely, with the whole of an ordinary morning in front of them. Edmund looked at her across the table. "You fixed the window latch again," he said. "It sticks in cold weather," she said. "It always has." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something confirmed what he already knew. Outside, the winter sun was finding its angle across the frost-covered grounds, and the light that came through the kitchen windows was the particular gold of a morning that intends to be clear. Wren wrapped both hands around her cup. She was home, not because she had arrived somewhere new, but because she had finally been seen in the place she had always been. And that, it turned out, was more than enough. Because the world does not always reward the ones who announce themselves. Sometimes it simply turns slowly and with great care toward the ones who were always, quietly, already there. If this story moved you, if you stayed until the end and felt something real, then do 3 things right now. Subscribe to the channel, because every week we bring you a story built exactly like this one: human, emotional, and worth every minute. Leave a like. It takes 1 second and it means everything for the channel to keep growing. And share this video with someone who needs a story that reminds them that being seen, truly seen, is always worth the wait. We'll see you in the next one.